Hello and welcome to the Bed Stories channel tonight as the day grows quiet and the world begins to slow. We travel into one of the most severe and disciplined societies of the ancient world. Our story leads us to Sparta, a city feared across Greece, admired by some, misunderstood by many, and remembered above all for the warriors it produced. But Spartan soldiers were not simply born brave, they were made. Tonight we explore the Agoge, the extraordinary system through which Sparta attempted to transform boys into warrior citizens and instruments of the state in the ancient Greek world. Sparta occupied a unique place. It was not the richest city, nor the most artistic, nor the most innovative in philosophy or architecture, while Athens built temples, cultivated drama, and argued over politics in the marketplace. Sparta fashioned itself into something harder and colder. It became a society organized around discipline, obedience, endurance. And war. This did not happen by accident. Sparta lay in the region of Laconia, in the southern Peloponnese, surrounded by mountains and nourished by the valley of the Eurotas River. Its land was fertile enough to sustain a powerful state, but its way of life was shaped not by abundance alone, but by conquest and fear. Long before the classical age, the Spartans had subdued neighboring peoples, especially in Messenia, reducing many of them to the status of helots, an unfree population, bound to the land and forced to work for their Spartan masters. These helots vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens themselves. That fact shaped everything. Sparta was not merely a military society because it admired strength. It was a military society because it believed it had no choice. A small ruling class surrounded by a much larger subject population had to remain constantly prepared for rebellion, unrest, and war. Every generation of Spartan men was expected to defend the state, not only against foreign enemies, but against the ever-present danger within. To maintain such a system, Sparta needed citizens who were disciplined, fearless, and utterly loyal to the collective. Individual comfort mattered little. Personal freedom, in the sense other Greeks understood it, was limited. The needs of the state stood above all else, and so from an early age Spartan life was shaped by one central question: how could a city create men who would never break? The answer was the Agoge. The exact origins of the Agoge are difficult to trace. Ancient tradition often linked the Spartan constitution to the semi-legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, who was said to have given Sparta its austere customs, communal discipline, and rigorous institutions. Whether Lycurgus was a single historical figure, a composite memory, or an idealized invention of later generations remains uncertain. But in Spartan memory, he represented the spirit of the system, sacrifice of self for the state, simplicity over luxury, obedience over indulgence. By the classical period, the Agoge had become one of Sparta's defining institutions. To outsiders, it seemed harsh, even cruel. To Spartans, it was necessary. The process began almost at birth. Ancient writers, especially Plutarch, describe Spartan newborns being examined by elders of the community. If an infant appeared healthy and strong, it would be allowed to live and be raised within the household. If it seemed weak, deformed, or unlikely to grow into a capable citizen, the child might be exposed, left to die in a ravine or wilderness. Modern historians debate how literally such accounts should be taken, and whether these practices were as systematic as later sources suggest. Ancient authors often emphasized Spartan severity to astonish their readers, yet even if some details were exaggerated, the broader point is clear. Spartan society placed extraordinary value on physical fitness and future military usefulness. From the very beginning of life, a Spartan child was never regarded as belonging entirely to his family. He belonged to the state. In early childhood, boys remained with their mothers, and Spartan women played a far greater role in child rearing than women. In many other Greek cities, Spartan mothers were expected to be strong, practical, and emotionally disciplined. They did not simply raise children in tenderness, they were expected to prepare them for hardship. Ancient sayings attributed to Spartan women reflect this fierce ethos. The most famous, though likely polished by later retelling, is the command supposedly given to sons: departing for war, come back with your shield, or on its meaning was unmistakable: return victorious, or return dead but never return indiscreven. Before entering formal training, Spartan boys were shaped by an atmosphere of competition, toughness, and restraint. They were taught to speak briefly and directly. The famously laconic style of speech, sharp, concise, cutting, became one of Sparta's cultural signatures. To speak too much was seen as weakness. To endure pain silently was a virtue. Within. At around the age of 7, a decisive separation took place. The boy left the relative shelter of the household. From that moment onward, he entered the Agoge proper. This was not a school in the ordinary sense. It was not designed to broaden the mind in the way Athenians might have understood education. Spartan boys did learn some music, some poetry, and basic literacy, but these were never the center of the system. The true purpose of the Agoge was moral, physical, and military. It sought to reshape the child completely, to harden the body, discipline the will, and dissolve the individual into the collective identity of Sparta's 7-year-old boys were grouped into herds or ageli under the supervision of older youths and officials. From then on, much of their life became communal. They slept together, trained together, ate together, fought together. The private world of family receded. The public world of Spartan discipline took its place. Their clothing was minimal. Ancient sources often note that boys received only a single cloak for the year and were expected to endure cold, heat, and discomfort without complaint. They frequently went barefoot, which toughened their feet and forced them to adapt to rough ground. Beds were not soft. They were expected to gather reeds from the banks of the Leonidas and make sleeping pallets for themselves, sometimes with their bare hands. Food was deliberately limited. This was one of the most revealing features of the Agoge. Spartan boys were under on purpose. The goal was not kindness, but training. Hunger was meant to teach resourcefulness, and endurance. Boys were expected to steal food if they could, slipping through shadows and moving silently enough to avoid detection. If they succeeded there, cunning was admired. If they were caught, they were punished, not for stealing, but for doing it badly. This detail reveals much about Spartan values. Survival, deception, stealth, and competence were all encouraged, but only when executed successfully. Failure invited humiliation and pain. In this way, the Agoge taught not only toughness, but a harsh practical lesson. Results mattered more than excuse. Discipline was constant. Older youths and magistrates observed the boys closely. They fought among themselves, competed physically, and were judged for their courage, obedience, and self-control. A boy who cried too easily, complained too loudly, or hesitated under pressure risked ridicule and beatings. Endurance of pain was cultivated almost as a civic virtue. The Agoge was not merely a machine for creating physical resilience. It was also designed to shape hierarchy. From an early age, Spartan boys learned to obey those above them and dominate those below them. Older youth supervised younger ones. Stronger boys were expected to lead. Weaker ones were tested, corrected, and often harshly treated. The system reproduced the structure of Spartan society itself: strict rank, constant scrutiny, and submission to communal authority. And always behind everything lay the military purpose. Sparta did not need independent thinkers in large numbers. It needed men who could hold the line, men who would not flee, men who would endure hunger, cold blood, terror, and exhaustion without shattering. As the boys moved through the years of the Agoge, the test would only become harder. Their world would grow harsher, more competitive, and more dangerous. They would be pushed toward combat, secrecy, ritual, humiliation, and perhaps even state-sanctioned violence against the helots themselves. For the Agoge was not simply a childhood of hardship. It was a carefully engineered path into the most feared warrior culture in Greece. And for a Spartan boy, the real ordeal had only just begun. As Spartan boys advanced deeper into the Agoge, the system tightened around them what had begun at the age of 7. As separation from the household and entry into communal discipline now became something more deliberate and severe. The boys were no longer merely being toughened, they were being measured, compared, ranked, and shaped into future participants in the most demanding citizen culture in Greece. At the center of this process stood supervision. The Agoge was not a loose tradition left to chance. It was organized, monitored, and reinforced by the institutions of the Spartan state. Ancient sources mention officials associated with the upbringing of youth, including the paidnomos, a magistrate responsible for overseeing the conduct and training of boys. Under him were older youths and selected young men who enforced rules, imposed punishments, and ensured that discipline reached into every corner of daily life. In Sparta, childhood was never entirely private. The boy was watched, was judged not only by teachers or family members, but by the wider community. Older men observed behavior in silence. A poor answer, an undisciplined movement, an act of fear, or even an excessive speech could invite correction. The city seemed to surround the child with expectations from every direction. These constant scrutiny had a purpose. Spartan citizens were expected to live not for themselves, but for the collective. Shame therefore became one of the most powerful tools in their education. To fall short in front of others was painful. To be thought soft, cowardly, or undisciplined could mark a boy deeply. Honor and humiliation were woven into everyday life so thoroughly that they became inseparable from identity itself. At the same time, physical training intensified. The boys wrestled, ran, jumped, and engaged in mock combat. They were pushed to develop balance, coordination, speed, and resilience. Their bodies were not sculpted for beauty in the manner later admired in idealized Greek statuary. Those Spartan bodies were surely admired too. Rather, they were conditioned for utility, to march long distances, to endure deprivation, to strike, to grapple, to stand firm in formation. This distinction matters. Spartan training was not aimed at individual athletic glory alone, though athletic competition had its place in Greek life, and Spartans did participate in festivals and contests. The larger aim of the Agoge was collective combat effectiveness. Every exercise existed within a wider logic of warfare, and obedience. Music also played a role. That to modern ears, this may sound surprising. In such a severe society, Spartans learned songs, choral performance, and rhythmic movement. But music in Sparta was not merely decorative. It cultivated order, timing, and social cohesion. Choral singing trained groups to move and act together. Martial songs preserved memory, celebrated courage, and reinforced communal values. Even poetry in Sparta often served discipline rather than introspection. Line between culture and military purpose was thin. Boys also learned brevity of speech. Spartan reputation for concise, cutting expression was not just a matter of personality. It was cultivated. A boy who rambled, answered carelessly, or failed to show clarity of thought could be reprimanded. Replies were expected to be sharp, economical, and intelligent. This practice helped shape the legendary laconic manner, for which Spartans became known throughout Greece. To speak briefly was to show control. To speak effectively with few words was to show mental discipline. For all this structure, the Agoge also included violence, not accidental violence, but educational violence. Beatings were a normal part of Spartan upbringing. Boys could be whipped for disobedience, incompetence, or simply as part of endurance training. Pain was not treated as something to be avoided, it was something to be mastered. To cry out too much under punishment was shameful. To bear suffering without visible collapse was admired. Dancing and writers preserved stories that reveal how far this ideal could go. One famous account tells of Spartan boys enduring flogging at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, sometimes to the point of serious injury or death. Modern scholars debate how early and how central such rituals were, and whether later writers exaggerated them to emphasize Spartan extremity, but there is little doubt that public endurance of pain formed part of Spartan civic identity. A community that expected men to stand calmly in battle under arrows and spears. First trained boys to stand calmly under the lash, and this was not merely about physical courage, it was about self-command. Spartans feared disorder above all things, disorder in ranks, disorder in speech, disorder in appetite, disorder in emotion. To govern the self was the beginning of being fit to serve the cities. Boys grew older. Competition among them became sharper. Groups and age classes developed internal hierarchies. Rivalry was encouraged, but not in the sense of unrestrained ego. Rather, the system sought to produce ambition. Within the discipline, a boy should strive to excel, but always within the framework of obedience and communal identity. Excellence that threatened cohesion was dangerous. Excellence that strengthened the group was celebrated. One of the most important relationships in this world was that between younger boys and older youths, or young men. Ancient sources suggest that mentoring bonds were central to Spartan education. These relationships could involve admiration, instruction, supervision, and emotional formation. In broader Greek culture, such bonds often carried aristocratic or pedagogical significance, and in Sparta, they seem to have been closely linked to the transmission of values. The older figure served as model, monitor, and guide. The younger boy was expected to respond with respect and emulation. The system helped bind generations together. A Spartan boy was not formed in isolation. He was pulled upward by examples above him and pressed forward by expectations from behind. Every stage of the Agoge prepared him not only to fight, but to take his place in an unbroken chain of Spartan citizenship. And still the material conditions of life remained hard. Limited clothing, rough bedding, and chronic hunger continued to shape daily experience. Hunger in particular was a constant teacher. It sharpened the senses, it made boys cunning, it forced them to learn stealth. The famous encouragement to steal food was not a playful custom, it was a harsh lesson in adaptability. A warrior could not expect comfort, he must know how to survive when supplies failed and conditions collapsed. There is a revealing story preserved in ancient tradition about a Spartan boy who had stolen a fox cub and hidden it beneath his cloak. Rather than reveal the theft, when questioned, he supposedly allowed the animal to claw and bite into his body until he died. Whether literal or embellished, the story captured exactly the kind of moral image Spartans admired. Pain endured in silent, self-control maintained beyond reason, weakness concealed even at terrible cost. Outsiders, such tales sounded monstrous. To Spartans, they sounded exemplary. Be adolescents. The Agoge became harsher. Stilled boys were no longer simply children. Under instruction, they were becoming nearmen, and Sparta expected more from them. Their bodies were stronger, their training more advanced, and the line between exercise and real military preparation began to fade. They fought harder, endured greater punishments, and faced higher expectations of loyalty and composure. At this stage, social discipline mattered as much as physical toughness. A future Spartan warrior had to be capable of functioning within the phalanx, the tightly packed formation of hoplites whose power depended on cohesion more than individual display. In such warfare, panic by one man could endanger many. A soldier who broke ranks, acted rashly, or pursued private glory at the expense of formation could bring disaster. The Agoge, therefore, was not creating berserkers, it was creating controlled men who could submit to order without hesitation, men who could suppress fear, because they had been taught from childhood that fear was shameful, men who could trust the man beside them, because both had been shaped by the same pitiless system. And there was another element to this transformation, one darker still. Spartan boys were being trained not only to defend Sparta from foreign enemies, but to participate in the domination of the Hellid population. The city's military culture cannot be understood apart from this internal reality. The greatest fear of Sparta was not always invasion from abroad, it was uprising from below. The Helots, after all, outnumbered the Spartan citizens many times over. Their labor sustained the system, but their presence haunted it. That fear would eventually shape one of the most controversial and chilling aspects of Spartan youth culture, the cryptia. Whether the cryptia was an elite survival test, a secret police institution, a rite of passage, or some combination of these remains debated by historians. Ancient sources are fragmentary and not always consistent. but many describe it as a system in which selected young Spartans were sent out into the countryside lightly equipped, forced to survive by stealth, and in some accounts encouraged or authorized to kill helots deemed dangerous or rebellious. If so, the implications are Servetus was not simply military training, it was political terror woven into education. A Spartan youth who entered such a world would learn not only endurance and stealth, but domination through fear. He would learn that the preservation of Sparta required violence not just in battle, but in the management of those beneath. In this sense, the Agoge reveals the deeper truth of Sparta. It was not merely a school for courage, it was an institution built to preserve a profoundly unequal order. And as the boys approached manhood, the final phase of their transformation drew near. Soon they would leave behind childhood entirely and enter a harsher world of young warriors, mess halls near constant supervision, and the long path toward full citizenship. And then would it become clear whether the Agoge had truly succeeded in what it promised to turn boys into Spartan speak. The later teenage years, the Spartan boy had already been stripped of much that other Greek youths might have considered ordinary privacy, softness, abundance, and personal choice had all been reduced or deliberately denied. What remained was a harder shape of life, one increasingly directed toward service, obedience, and military usefulness. No, the Agoge entered its most decisive facet. Youth who had once been separated from his household at 7 was no longer merely being tested. He was being prepared to cross the threshold into the adult structure of Spartan society. This transition did not happen in a single moment, nor was it simply marked by age alone. It unfolded through years of intensified discipline, public evaluation, and gradual absorption into the male institutions that governed Spartan life. At this point, physical maturity mattered more than ever. A future Spartan hoplite needed broad shoulders to bear the shield, endurance for long marches, balance on rough terrain, and the capacity to remain effective while tired, hungry, and frightened. Training continued to sharpen the body through wrestling, running, group exercises, and combat practice. But now, the emphasis shifted even more clearly toward readiness for real military service. And spare the shield, the controlled step of formation, the discipline of standing one's ground, all these lay ahead. And yet the Spartans did not seem to imagine that battlefield competence came from technique alone. They believed it grew from character. In their eyes, a weak spirit would eventually betray even a strong body, so the psychological shaping of the youth remained relentless. Science Spartans were expected to display composure in public, respect toward elders, and emotional restraint in almost every circumstance. Laughter could exist, but excess was frowned upon. Appetite was to be managed. Anger was to be contained until useful. Pain was to be borne. Fear was not to be confessed. In many ways, the Agoge was an assault not only on bodily weakness, but on visible vulnerability itself. This produced a distinctive ideal of masculinity. A Spartan man was not expected to be eloquent in the Athenian sense, nor highly decorative, nor given to philosophical display. He was expected to be hard-controlled, useful, loyal, and dangerous. When required, his dignity came less from self-expression than from discipline. His worth was measured less by what he said than by what he could endure, and how steadfastly he could serve the Sicilian youths near adulthood. They also moved more deeply into the collective life that defined full Spartan citizenship. One of the most important institutions awaiting them was the Sicilian, the common mess, or communal dining group in which adult Spartan males took their meals together. This institution was far more than a place to eat. It was one of the foundations of Spartan political and social identity. Membership in a mess group tied a man to a circle of peers who would fight beside him, judge him, and depend on him. A Spartan did not dine privately in comfort as an isolated household master. Hate among comrades. Food itself was famously plain. Ancient writers, often half appalled and half fascinated, described Spartan meals as austere, even unpleasant to outsiders. The notorious black broth became emblematic of this simplicity. Whether all descriptions were exaggerated or not, the message was clear. Luxury had no honorable place in the daily life of a Spartan citizen. Even sustenance was subordinated to discipline, and sameness for a young Spartan. Admission into a mess group was crucial. It marked acceptance into the adult male community. With it, such inclusion, full participation in Spartan citizenship was jeopardized. This meant that the transition into adulthood depended not only on age or training, but on social recognition. The individual had to prove himself worthy of belonging, and belonging in Sparta came at a price. Every Spartan citizen was expected to contribute food from estates worked by helots. Here again, the entire warrior system revealed its hidden dependence. The severe, disciplined life of the Spartan male rested on the labor of others who had no share in the honor it produced. The citizen warrior could devote himself to training and arms because the helot sustained the material foundation of his life. Spartan equality among citizens was made possible by the subordination of those outside citizenship. The young men entering adulthood were therefore inheriting not just a military identity, but a social order based on exclusion and control. At around the age of 20, a major transition took place. A Spartan male now became eligible for military service. In a more formal and serious sense, he had not yet reached the full civic standing reserved for older men, But he was no longer merely in preparation. He was part of the fighting body of Spartacus. Did not mean the Agoge suddenly ended Spartan formation continued long after childhood. In many respects, the entire early adult life of a Spartan remained supervised and disciplined yet 20 marked. The point at which the youth began to take his place among warriors of in marriage did not necessarily release him from the communal system a young Spartan man might marry, but he often continued to live and eat primarily with his military peers. Rather than establishing an entirely separate domestic life, this feature astonished other Greeks. In many Peleus, marriage meant the clear formation of an independent household in Sparta. However, the demands of the collective remained stronger than the pull of private family life. Husbands were sometimes said to visit wives discreetly, or only at limited times during the early years, as if the city feared that domestic attachment might soften martial discipline. Whether every detail of these accounts should be taken literally is uncertain. Ancient writers sometimes delighted in presenting Sparta as a place of strange and severe customs, but the broader pattern is credible enough. The city deliberately limited the power of private life over public obligation. A Spartan belonged first to Spartan, gradually did full political adulthood emerge at the age of 30. A Spartan male generally gained fuller civic rights, including participation in the assembly by then if he had survived childhood discipline, youth training, early military service, and social selection. He had become what Sparta most valued, a citizen soldier fully integrated into the statethid. Long path reveals something essential about the Agoge. It was never just a childhood education. It was the opening stage of a lifelong civic conditioning given. As adults, Spartans remained bound by expectations formed in youth. Simplicity in dress, restraint in speech, loyalty to comrades, endurance under hardship, and submission to collective authority did not disappear with age. The Agoge succeeded insofar as it did succeed, because it was embedded within a whole social system that reinforced the same values over decades. This helps explain why Sparta made such a powerful impression on the Greek imagination. Though admirers, the city seemed to have solved a problem that haunted many ancient societies: how to place discipline above selfishness. To critics, it had done so by crushing individuality and subordinating nearly everything human to military necessity. But views contain truth. There is no doubt that Spartan training could produce men of extraordinary steadiness in battle. Greek warfare in the hoplite age depended above all on cohesion, nerve, and trust. The phalanx was not a place for panic. Shields overlapped, spearmen moved in compact ranks. The pressure of bodies, bronze dust, shouting, and death could unravel an undisciplined force in moments. A man who had been trained from boyhood to suppress fear, obey commands, and endure pain had real advantages in such conditions. Spartan success on the battlefield was not a myth invented from nothing, but neither was it simple perfection. Baggage produced strengths, yet those strengths came with costs. A society so narrowly organized around martial discipline could be rigid. Innovation in many areas was limited. Population decline among full Spartan citizens became a serious long-term problem. The system's exclusivity made it formidable, but also fragile. It could create elite warriors, yet it struggled to adapt to changing political and military reality. 7. Within the training itself, one can sense the losses. The Agoge cultivated courage, but also cruelty. It taught loyalty, but often by suppressing tenderness. It produced discipline, but at the cost of freedom. It trained boys to endure hunger, cold, humiliation, and violence. But such training did not merely remove weakness, it also narrowed the emotion, an intellectual space in which a person might become something other than what the state required, instilled to the Spartans themselves. These sacrifices appeared necessary. They believed they were preserving a way of life under permanent threat. The helots below them, rival states around them, and the unpredictability of war all justified severity in their own eyes. In that sense, the Agoge was not madness to them. It was reason shaped by fear. But now the Spartan youth had become a man fit to enter the ranks, lean, disciplined, hardened by deprivation, and bound tightly to the institutions of his city. Soon he would stand in bronze armor beneath the hot Greek sun, shield on arm, spear in hand, one figure in a living wall of Spartan order. But before we judge what the Agoge truly achieved, we must see where it led. For the measure of Spartan education was not found in the training ground alone. It was found in war and leadership, in crisis, in the preservation of the state, and eventually in the limits of the very system Sparta had trusted for so long. Only there, under the full weight of history, can we ask whether the Agoge truly made warriors, or whether it made something more complicated, more impressive, and more tragic than that. The truest test of the Agoge was never the training, the whipping post, or the communal mess. It was battle. Only there could Sparta discover whether years of hunger, hardship, discipline, and submission had produced what the city believed it needed most: men who would hold when others broke in. For a long time, it seemed that the system worked across the Greek world. The reputation of Spartan warriors became immense. Other cities could field brave men. Many could produce skilled fighters, but Sparta came to represent something more unsettling and more admired: a society in which war was not an activity separate from ordinary life, but the final expression of it. The Spartan hoplite stepping into battle was not a farmer temporarily bearing arms nor a citizen dividing his attention between politics, trade, and military service. He was the product of a civic order that had shaped him from childhood toward this very moment. That distinction mattered enormously. In the age of hoplite warfare, Greek battles were often decided not by elaborate maneuvers, but by cohesion, morale, and discipline under pressure. The heavy infantry formations advanced toward one another, with shields overlapping and spears leveled. Then came the impact, the crash of wood and bronze, the choking dust, the splintering shafts, the screams of wounded men, the terrible compression of bodies pushing forward in confusion and fear. In that environment, much depended on whether a soldier could master panic. Spartans believed their entire educational system existed to make that mastery possible. Youth raised in the Agoge had already been taught to endure pain, without display, obey, without hesitation, compete without losing discipline, and accept shame as worse than death. In theory, all this translated perfectly to the battlefield. He would not flee, because he had been taught from childhood that dishonor was intolerable. He would not abandon formation, because his identity had been forged in the group, not in the isolated self. He would not collapse at the sight of blood, noise, and suffering, because hardship had long ago become ordinary. Whether every Spartan lived up to this ideal is another matter. No human training can completely erase fear, but Sparta undoubtedly created a culture in which fear was managed differently than in most places. Men learned to conceal it, contain it, and continue functioning beneath its weight. This helps explain the extraordinary moral force of Spartan battlefield reputation. In Greek warfare, reputation mattered almost as much as steel. If an enemy line believed that the men facing it would never break, that belief alone could alter the confidence of both sides. Before the clash even began, Spartans benefited from this psychological advantage. Again and again, they seemed unshakable, because so much of their society had been dedicated to appearing and often becoming exactly that. Yet the battlefield also reveals the limitations of the Agoge. Spartan warfare excelled in a world for which it had been designed. Disciplined hoplite conflict among Greek players, especially on land, where heavy infantry cohesion mattered most. In that context, the Spartan system was formidable, but as warfare evolved, as naval power became decisive, as strategy demanded greater flexibility, and as political conditions changed, the narrow strengths of Sparta could become weaknesses. In the classical period, the city did not always dominate through sheer military genius. Its excellence lay above all its steadiness, training, and morale. It could produce elite infantry, but it was not automatically superior in every form of conflict. Other Greek states, particularly Athens in its naval sphere, and later Thebes with its tactical innovation, exposed the fact that discipline alone was not the whole of war. Still, to understand the Agoge's power, one need only imagine the fully armed Spartan. Leonidas' sun is high above the plain. Bronze helmets flash and hard light red cloaks stir in the dry wind before battle, then are cast aside as men close ranks. The great round shields overlap, spears angle forward, flute music sounds calm, measured, deliberate, helping regulate the advance. This detail often struck ancient observers with astonishment, while other armies shouted and surged in disorder. Spartans were said to move with eerie composure, guided by rhythm. And the violence and discipline behind such a scene was not improvised in adulthood. It had been built over decades. Man in the line had once been a barefoot boy, stealing scraps of food, sleeping on reeds, swallowing pain in silence, and learning never to stand apart from the group. The phalanx was, in a sense, the final visible form of the Agoge. The group that had dominated his childhood now reappeared in martial perfection. And yet even here a deeper truth emerges. The Agoge was not only preparing men to die bravely for Sparta, it was preparing them to sustain an entire system of power. Spartan military discipline was inseparable from the city's internal order. The same men who held formation against foreign enemies also served as the guardians of a society built upon hellish labor and permanent inequality. Their courage was real, but it was courage in defense of a harsh political structure. Their endurance was extraordinary, but it existed in service to a state that demanded brutal submission not only from its own youth, but from those it dominated. This moral ambiguity is impossible to ignore for later generations, especially in modern imagination. Sparta has often been romanticized as a place of pure strength, simplicity, and sacrifice, but the closer one looks, the more complex the picture becomes. The Agoge did produce men of remarkable discipline. It also normalized violence, institutionalized fear, and subordinated tenderness, curiosity, and individuality to the needs of the same system that could produce Leonidas at Thermopylae also produced a society in which boys were hardened through hunger and pain, and young men may have been trained to terrorize helots in the countryside. These are not separate stories. They are the same story seen from different angles. In the long run, Sparta's success carried within it the seeds of strength. Citizen body remained small and became smaller still. Full Spartiate status was difficult to maintain. Economic inequality among Spartans grew over time, undermining the ideal of citizen equality. Demographic decline weakened the very military elite the Agoge was meant to sustain. What had once been a powerful engine of cohesion became harder to preserve generation after generation. Then came the deeper strategic challenge. The Greek world changed during the Peloponnesian War. Sparta ultimately defeated Athens, but this victory came through a conflict that exposed how much more complex warfare had become. Naval alliances, Persian money-shifting coalitions, and prolonged campaigning mattered as much as hoplite excellence. Sparta could still win, but not solely through the old certainties of its land-based military culture. Later, in the 4th century BC, Thebes shattered the aura of Spartan invincibility. At the Battle of Leuctra, their disciplined innovation and tactical brilliance overcame the prestige of the old warrior state. It was one of the clearest demonstrations that no educational system, however severe, can permanently guarantee supremacy. Yet even after political decline, the image of Spartan training in Greek writers, Roman admirers, and much later European thinkers all returned to Sparta with fascination. Some praised its discipline, others recoiled from its severity. Philosophers treated it as a model, or a warning. Moralists pointed to it as proof that character could be forged by law, and custom critics cited it as evidence of what happens when the state claims too much power over human life. This afterlife of the Agoge is itself remarkable. Very few ancient institutions have exercised such a powerful grip on later imagination verbs, because the Agoge touches a question that never disappears. What does a society gain, and what does it lose when it places collective strength above personal freedom? Sparta answered that question in its own way. It gained discipline, martial prestige, and social cohesion of a terrifying kind, but it lost softness, openness, flexibility, and much of the richness that made other Greek cultures flourish in different ways. A boy raised in the Agoge might become steadfast beyond ordinary measure. He might also become a man unable to imagine life except within structures of command, domination, and obedience. Such a man could be admirable in battle and diminished in other parts of human experience. This is why the Agoge remained so compelling. It was not merely a school, it was an attempt to engineer character at the level of civilization. Like all such attempts, it revealed both the power and the danger of shaping human beings to completely for a single purpose. Be the end of a Spartan's training, the transformation seemed complete. The child had been absorbed into the city. The body hardened, the speech sharpened, the appetites disciplined, the emotions narrowed, the loyalties fixed. It had been made into what Sparta needed. But in the end, history would ask whether that need was to narrow to endure, and in the final measure of time, it was not enough for Sparta merely to create warriors. It also needed to survive as a society. That final reckoning belongs to the legacy of the Agoge itself. In the end, the Agoge succeeded, but only in the way tragic systems often succeeded, achieved what Sparta demanded of it. It hardened boys into disciplined men. It trained citizens to endure pain, obey command, suppress fear, and subordinate themselves to the collective. It helped create the most feared infantry tradition in Greece and gave Sparta an aura of martial superiority that lasted for generations. Few institutions in the ancient world shaped human beings so thoroughly or so deliberately, yet that very success came at a cost so great that it is impossible to separate admiration from unease. The Agoge made warriors, yes, but it did so by narrowing the human being into something closer to a civic weapon. It did not simply teach courage, it taught sanctioned hardness. It did not merely produce loyalty, it demanded submission. It did not only cultivate resilience, it normalized deprivation, humiliation, and violence as tools of formation. To Sparta, these sacrifices were justified because the state believed itself locked in permanent danger. A small ruling citizen body dominated a much larger Helot population and feared collapse from within as much as attack from without. The Agoge was in that sense a system born from insecurity. It was less the expression of confident strength than the disciplined answer to chronic fear. That insight changes how we see Sparta. The city has often been remembered in bold outlines, red cloaks, bronze shields, short speeches, fearless warriors, but behind the image stood a society under pressure, attempting to preserve itself by shaping its children with extraordinary severity. The Agoge was not only a monument to Spartan discipline, it was also evidence of how much Sparta believed it had to control in order to survive for a time. That control work at Sparta dominated the imagination of Greece. Its soldiers were admired even by enemies. Its educational system became a subject of fascination for philosophers and historians. The very word Spartan would outlive the city's power and become shorthand for austerity, endurance, and self-denial. But history does not reward rigidity. Forever same society that produced elite warriors struggled to adapt to changing circumstances. Its citizen population declined, its economy rested uneasily on coerced labor. Its military excellence, though genuine, was tailored to a narrow set of conditions. When the Greek world evolved politically and militarily, Sparta's strengths were no longer enough to guarantee supremacy. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the Agoge. Can shape man for a purpose I cannot by itself solve. Every problem of history, no training system, however severe, can permanently protect a society from demographic change, economic imbalance, strategic transformation, or political decline. Sparta tried to build permanence through discipline, but discipline alone could not preserve what time wore, and internal contradictions slowly wore down. Still, the memory of the Agoge endures. because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How much hardship can education justify in the name of strength when? Does discipline become cruel to encourage be taught? Without tenderness being lost, what happens? When a society values usefulness more than humanity, Spartans answered those questions in the harshest way known to the Greek world. They believed the city had the right to claim the child, direct the body, and shape the soul for collective ends. To many later admirers, this seemed noble. To many later critics, it seemed monstrous, but the responses are understandable. There is something undeniably powerful in the image of the Spartan youth, barefoot, hungry, silent, enduring, growing into the calm warrior who would not abandon his comrades in battle. But there is also something chilling in the same image. A child denied softness so thoroughly that pain becomes normal, fear becomes unspeakable, and worth is measured almost entirely by service to the state. Agoge then is not merely the story of how Sparta turned boys into warriors. It is the story of how a civilization tried to conquer human weakness by force of law, ritual, deprivation, and habit. One remarkable victory, but it also revealed the cost of trying to make human beings to perfect for warranty. And writers preserved many sayings attributed to Sparta, but perhaps none captures its ethos more clearly than the spirit behind the famous command given by Spartan mothers to their sons: return with your shield, or on it. Whether or not every such phrase was truly spoken, the idea behind it was real. Life was secondary. To honor survival without duty was no triumph. The city mattered more than the individual. That was the moral world the Agoge created. For centuries, the world remembered it. Thank you for listening tonight on the Bed Stories channel as this story of Spartan childhood, discipline, and destiny fades into the quiet of the night. One truth remains clear: Sparta did not simply train soldiers, it built an entire way of life around the belief that character could be forged like iron, and in doing so, it left behind one of history's most unforgettable lessons: that the making of warriors is never only about strength, it is also about what a society is willing to sacrifice to create them.